Welcome to everybody who's joining today's webinar. It's 12 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Sarah Polano. I work with Getting Hired, so some of you I may have spoken to before. I'm an account manager here on the Getting Hired team, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar is presented by AutismSpeaks, a very close partner to Getting Hired, and the topic is 4 reasons why it's important to employ individuals with autism. We have Dave and Leslie on, and so we wanted to thank you all again for joining today. My contact information will be included at the end of the presentation if you would like to reach out to us with any additional questions along with Dave and Leslie. But Dave and Leslie, I know you're on. If you would like to go ahead and provide an introduction, please feel free to do so.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And we'd like to thank you and the rest of the Getting Hired team for putting this together and inviting us to join your member companies. We're very grateful for the opportunity, and we think this is a really important discussion that we want to just make sure people with autism are included. And when we're talking about the disability community and as part of your diversity and inclusion goals and practices, it's very important to us that people with autism are part of that conversation. And if we can provide some insight and some tips into how we can make sure this is successful for both companies and prospective employees on the spectrum, that's what we're here for. So my name is Dave. I'm the Director of Adult Services at AutismSpeaks. You'll also meet Leslie, our Vice President of Adult Services. If you're interested in our bios, I think that information went out, but I thought it would be maybe just a little bit more interesting to tell you a little bit about what else we are working on for priorities for us in adult services anyway. Really, that begins in the transition process. We'll touch on that a little bit today, but the transition from school to adulthood, it really begins around age 14. And we also look at, in addition to employment, housing and residential supports for adults with autism. There's a terrific need in that area. Post-secondary education options, not just in traditional 4-year colleges and universities, but also trade schools and technical schools and community colleges and even life skills programs for people who are perhaps more profoundly impacted by their autism. Leslie, do you want to say hello?
Yes, thanks. I am, as Dave indicated, Leslie Long, Vice President of Adult Services for AutismSpeaks, and I just want to reiterate the importance of having the partnership so that we increase the employment for people with autism, and we'll get into during the presentation what that looks like now and what we hope it looks like. I also want to let you know that we've been working with people with autism on employment issues for many, many years. We've worked with a lot of companies. So we're talking to you from years of experience, and hopefully we can create some insight into that experience. So thank you very much, and Dave, if you want to get started, that'd be great.
Sure. And just, one other note that there's a whole lot else that AutismSpeaks does, and if you're interested in learning about any of that, or our science research that we fund, or advocacy on Capitol Hill or in state capitals, please let us know. We can always share that information with you, offline. So we'll begin with just kind of an introduction to what is autism. So the real term that we use is actually the Autism Spectrum Disorder, or ASD. But you will hear people just simply say person with autism. You may hear someone refer to someone as being autistic. But really the most accepted language is to say a person with autism. So this is a very complex neurological disorder. You may call it a neurodevelopmental disorder. And what that basically means, this is a brain-based disability. It's developmental, so it begins early in life and it is lifelong. For most obvious signs of autism tend to appear between ages 2 and 3, but we're getting better and better at detecting the early signs as early as 18 months or even 1 year. A lot of interesting research being done there. And that's important because we know the earlier intervention is able to start, the better outcomes there are well into adulthood. So it makes a really big difference. Lately research is pointing out that this autism spectrum that we always knew was so vast, and we're going to talk about that and what that looks like in adults with autism. But there's such a wide range of levels of ability and disability that there is not just one autism, but possibly hundreds of different subtypes of autism spectrum disorder. So if you see the picture here, I kind of like this because until recently, I think most people pictured the autism spectrum on a line, like a linear graph, where at one end there are people who are extraordinarily bright academically and cognitively really capable. Maybe they have PhDs, and they're just kind of odd socially, kind of quirky people. And at the other end of that line are people who are nonverbal and maybe have intellectual disabilities and will never live independently. And those people do exist, but the true spectrum is this much more complex 360-degree, three-dimensional kind of an idea where there are lots of different skills and lots of different symptoms that all kind of play together, and there's really a diverse set of needs and abilities and skills that we'll see amongst people with autism. Let me go to the next slide here. So, what is it? What does it actually mean for someone if you have autism? So basically it's characterized by challenges in social skills and social interactions, challenges with speech and also nonverbal communication. And what we see also are repetitive or restrictive behaviors, sometimes called stereotyped behaviors. This may be one example of this is like the classic hand flapping that you may see someone with autism do, or sometimes called stimming. And it's really kind of a self-regulating, self-soothing behavior. But there's something interesting here that we'll touch on later where this is not just part of the disability, but actually may be a source of strength or interest and can be tapped into for a career. Some statistics that you may find interesting, it does affect far more boys than girls. You see some of the numbers here, 4 to 5 times more common. There's a lot of interesting research, though, going on that says maybe we're just missing it in girls. Maybe it presents somewhat differently, or girls are able to mask some of their challenges in a better way. So these numbers may change over time. The global prevalence rate is estimated to be about 1 to 2%. In the United States and in other Western countries, the prevalence estimate is pretty much staying stable for the time being at 1 in every 68 children. And this cuts across all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups. It does not discriminate. So why is this so important to us to talk about to employers? Well, these numbers are the prevalence estimates. They come from the CDC. You see kind of that graph in that dramatic trajectory, although, like I said, it appears to me to be leveling off here at 1 in every 68. But these are all groups of 8-year-olds that are taken at kind of snapshots in time in different parts of the country to get this estimate number, this prevalence estimate. And so as you see, the kids who were 8 years old 10 years ago are now 18 and so far and so forth. So this group of children that have really grown up with organizations like AutismSpeaks are now into adulthood. And we estimate that 50,000 teenagers with autism enter adulthood every year. So that's 500,000 of these people entering the workforce over this next decade. So this is really important. The numbers that Leslie will get into in a minute of unemployment and underemployment is a real challenge for us, but it also presents a huge opportunity. This is a tremendous, largely untapped labor source that we need to make sure that you're aware of. So part of the challenge we face is that when people think about autism, and this is partly, AutismSpeaks' fault and other organizations over the years doing so much work on awareness, all that awareness makes people picture young, very cute children, right, in school or working with a therapist. And it's just simply a mischaracterization that adults don't also have autism. So this is known as an invisible disability because there are no physical characteristics to autism. It's a neurological disorder, so they look like anyone else. Some do have some, odd behaviors or strange body movements at times, but for the most part, there's no way to physically tell them apart from anyone else. They are people with autism likely already working at your company. They may not have disclosed that to you. They may not actually have an official diagnosis, but we do know that people with autism have been, working and living amongst us for many years, and there are millions of adults with autism in our communities. So we talked about transition. I touched on transition and why that's so important to us at Autism Speaks. What I want you to know here is that there's this kind of dreaded moment for our families with autism that they call the autism cliff. And it doesn't mean that autism is going anywhere, that's a lifelong disability. What happens is the autism services do go away after the educational entitlement is over. So at age 21, in the United States at least, and this is true for most states, there are a couple of states that extend this, but for most people, their services, speech services, occupational therapy, all sorts of supports, social groups, and skill development, all that funding ends at 21. And what we see for the vast majority of people with autism is that they go home and they're on their couch, parents' couch, not working and not going to school. There are no programs for them to engage with others in, so there's no social interaction, and we see a great regression many times in their skills. They become socially isolated, depressed, and anxious. These are very common kind of outcomes that we see, and people with autism show worse outcomes than people even with intellectual disabilities or other disabilities as well. So they're kind of uniquely hurt by this services cliff as they enter adulthood. And that leads to some of the poor outcomes that we're going to talk about. So it's really important that we, and this is something that Autism Speaks works on very hard, to kind of make a difference during those later years in high school while they're still accessing funds from their local schools. We know that certain things do work. So the biggest predictor of success is when these kids have a chance to have some sort of work experience while they're still in school, while they still have access to teachers and maybe job coaches paid for by the school, relationships with local companies. You know, this is something to think about beyond just traditional employment, perhaps, for you, is apprenticeships, unpaid or paid work experiences for high school kids, job shadowing or just mentoring in the workplace. These all make a tremendous difference. You know, when, for instance, 50% more likely to be employed in their 20s when they've had an experience like this in school. So, you know, this can include things like community service and volunteering too. Just some experience out of the school and in the workplace is really important. So, Leslie, you want to talk a little bit about kind of the state of employment right now?
Yeah. So when we talk about the big picture of employment, we're talking about anyone on the spectrum, whether they're working or unemployed. And although the Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't keep stats on specifically people with autism, we know that for people with developmental disabilities, the unemployment rate is as high as 80%. Now, if you start getting into discussing employment with people with autism and you look at the studies that have been done as they leave school, you know that the unemployment rate is even higher. And we say up to 90% unemployed or underemployed, because even if somebody on the spectrum is working, most times they're working in jobs that are beneath their skill level because that's the only job they could find. So we know it's great to have a lower unemployment rate, certainly, but why is it really important to employ individuals with autism? First of all, we know that it's good for business. There is a lot of evidence on return on investment for companies that employ people on the spectrum. It's not about charity. People don't get jobs because the company wants to do something good, because it doesn't work out like that. If the person is qualified and able to do the job, it begins to really drive innovation and creative thinking and diversity when you have people on the spectrum that really do think differently and sort of out of the box. It also shows the customer that the corporation is diverse, and that really speaks to the customer base. They really welcome when you see diversity throughout the company. It creates more brand loyalty throughout the community. We also know, again, as I mentioned before, that it demonstrates the high return on investment, and it aids in 503 compliance if companies work at all with the government. So what are some of the challenges, and why is the unemployment rate so high? Because we know people have the skills to do the job, We know baby boomers are retiring at an unprecedented rate. We're going to have huge gaps in the workforce. So we know that there are jobs for people. Why aren't they getting those jobs? We've recognized some challenges over the years, particularly for people on the spectrum, that seem to knock them out of a job possibility. One of those is traditional interviews. It's really difficult for a person with autism to sit across from somebody and have this social reciprocity that is required in a traditional interview. So eye contact, asking questions like, what are your strengths? That's not where their assets lie. Their assets lie in the actual skill acquisition and actually doing the job. So having a traditional interview where you're requiring somebody to have a conversation goes right to the challenges for somebody on the spectrum. Again, having that back and forth and those subtle cues during a conversation are difficult for somebody on the spectrum. They are incredible learners in those skills, but in the initial interaction can be very difficult. And that speaks to the soft skill area. Again, a lot of us understand social cues in the workforce, know when somebody's done with a conversation and know when to end the conversation and walk away, or may use sarcasm or cliches to describe situations, and somebody on the spectrum may not get that. They may not understand that the facial expression you're given is, hey, listen, I'm done with the conversation, I have to go, or sarcasm that a manager may be annoyed with something. So that's a very difficult challenge for somebody on the spectrum to pick up those social cues and use them to their advantage in sustaining a job. And we know there's limited knowledge of people on the spectrum by employers because the awareness, as Dave indicated before, has been on young children. And there hasn't been a lot of good outreach on behalf of adults with autism. We're doing that, and we're doing that more and more, and we're seeing TV shows that outline people on the spectrum with skills. We're hearing about people that are incredible thinkers that are adults with autism, but for years we didn't focus on that, and what employers saw was not indicative of the vast spectrum of talents that we have in the autism community. So what are some of the incredible strengths of individuals? Well, we know people have strong visual skills. A lot of people on the spectrum, they can look at something and almost, if they have to recreate it, they can actually visualize the product they're looking at. Sometimes you'll see somebody draw a picture of something and they will draw exactly the dimensions of the picture, what the size of the buildings look like. It's an incredible visual skill that a large percentage of people on the spectrum have. Again, that good memory for details, looking at something and knowing exactly where things go or how something needs to be done is really incredibly advanced. Ability to focus on a task. So you'll hear about companies that hire people on the spectrum to test software or look for blips in software testing. And that's because they have an incredible ability to focus on a task and really just engage in that particular task. And it's really an amazing asset for a company. Special interests are being looked at more and more as a skill level. So, for example, if somebody has an incredible interest in the transportation industry, now we have Uber and we have MapQuest and we have all kinds of technology that somebody that really understands the transit system could really be a great, talented employee in that area. So, again, special interests, which could be anywhere from historical knowledge and running a museum to understanding the transit system and giving directions to an Uber driver. There's a percentage of people that have above average intelligence. People like to stick to the rules on the spectrum. If you tell them how to do something, they're going to do it that way each time because they know that's the right way to do it. Very honest. They will tell you if something doesn't seem right, or if something doesn't look right. Sometimes it can be a little disarming, but you're going to get an honest opinion from somebody on the spectrum. Their problem-solving ability, too, is really unique in the sense that they can look at something out of the box that nobody may have thought of and create a solution. And if you spend some time with somebody on the spectrum and you're trying to think of how to solve a particular problem, you're going to get some really creative and interesting ideas on how to solve that problem. And there are many more, which we'll get into later on. So I'm going to hand it back to Dave to talk about a shift in thinking.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. So as Leslie and I both mentioned, I think that part of the autism spectrum disorder diagnosis includes that restrictive or repetitive interest. And Leslie mentioned a really common one that there are lots of, especially boys with autism, who are, for lack of a better word, obsessed with trains or cars or transportation systems. The subway system here in New York, which is incredibly complex. And it was seen as part of a disability, that it interfered with learning and it interfered with socializing and getting friends. And that is true. But lately what we're seeing is much more of a positive approach to harnessing those interests or obsessions and gearing people towards careers that align with them. So, there's been some studies, there's some interesting technologies and apps out there now that are trying to kind of categorize these different interests and gear people towards industries and jobs that will allow them to work with what they love. Sometimes these are unusual interests, right? So someone with autism that we know, completely obsessed with elevators, elevator buttons, elevator models. He knows the history, he knows the different models and what was updated and all of this. And it did cause problems for him in school and with friends, but as he aged into adulthood, he's able to work as a technician on elevators. And who can say that that they work with their true love and passion every day? Not many of us. So this shift in perspective is interesting to us, and it is leading to more and more success stories that we're seeing out there for companies who are able to tap into that and for their employees with autism. So these are some things that we hear from employers. This is not from AutismSpeaks. This comes from employers who are employing people with autism. And they match up a lot with what Leslie talked about earlier with some of the strengths. So one of the first things they say is, companies recognize that change in prevalence that we showed earlier, that more and more of their customers are people with autism or families with autism. As the awareness level has really, really expanded and as the prevalence rate has gone up, you're hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't know someone with autism, some sort of connection. And this customer base is really loyal and very vocal. And they really do patronize companies that, that give their folks a chance. And employment is kind of that new area, But some companies are also trying to make their stores more autism-friendly for the customers, and that makes a difference too. Leslie talked about the out-of-the-box thinking, that unique problem-solving. Companies are definitely seeing that. They are committed and consistent. These are not your employees that you have to worry about coming in late or hungover, gossiping at the water cooler. They're just not interested. For the vast majority of them, their time on task that some companies have been able to measure is significantly higher than their employees without autism. There are just certain things that, because of the nature of their autism, they're just not wasting a whole lot of time with some of the things that you and I probably do, right? Also, the lower turnover. This is a huge area for companies that are identifying different pain points where they have high turnover and high costs due to retraining year after year because they have a huge turnover in a certain position. When they hire someone with autism or other disabilities, by the way, that turnover is much, much lower. People with autism who haven't been given any opportunities, who don't mind some of the tasks that require lots of repetition, day in, day out, the same stuff. In fact, they thrive on some of that routine activity. They show better performance, lower turnover. They're recognizing, some of these companies, that this is an untapped labor pool. Fewer absences, and the last one there is universal design. So what Leslie mentioned, the first strength, common strength of people with autism was visual learning, visual skills. And what we know is, like, if I asked, all 240 people on this webinar, who would prefer to learn something visually with, like, visual supports and images rather than just listen to me talking at them? Most of us would identify as being visual learners. And if we design workplaces for people with autism and other visual learners who really need a lot of visual supports, it helps everybody. And we've seen this across the board. Companies like Walgreens really started this, where they built from the ground up a new facility with lots of these kinds of visual supports, and it not only helped people with autism, it helped everyone who worked in that facility. So there's a lot of research out there on the business case for hiring people with disabilities, including autism. This list is part of what comes from, I'm forgetting the name of the group for a second, but there's a lot of research out there that you can take a look at. But basically, it's the things that Leslie touched on earlier. That return on investment, has been proven out. It's been demonstrated. So you can find the business case there. Turning some of these social challenges, like the unemployment problem, into a business opportunity and setting yourself apart from your competitors. The marketing, like we said, more and more customers and family members are people with disabilities. They have a tremendous amount of clout and market value, and this really does help these companies that are making a difference. And then that innovation, there's a lot of research into what, just recently there was something in the Harvard Business Review looking at which kind of teams would be the most innovative and problem-solving and more efficient problem solvers. They looked at different combinations of ages, of races, of genders, of all sorts of things, no differences. The biggest difference was if you have cognitive differences, if you have different types of thinkers, different types of problem solvers and styles of thinking. And that includes people with neurodiversity like autism. So we're seeing more and more research into this, and that business case is something you can certainly find. So what are some of the supports that people with autism need? The good news is the vast majority of these cost nothing. The most sustainable, most effective are what we call natural supports. So these are things that you and I do for each other, you do for your colleagues every day. You don't submit a paperwork to HR, saying that you spent 15 minutes on this and this is an accommodation that costs you some money. No, you just kind of support each other. Like Leslie and I support one another. She knows I'm not, super eager to pick up the phone and give someone a call out of the blue. Maybe she'll do that for me. I know that she's not super tech savvy all the time, and so I'll set up something on her calendar for her. And these are just supports we do all the time. Mentors in the workplace is a big part of this. If we have mentors identified for new employees on the spectrum, and this is most often, the mentor is most often someone who's a parent, so they're super interested in making this work. We've seen this be really successful. It doesn't cost anything extra. Technology is allowing us to do all sorts of things. Obviously, we all have tablets and smartphones at our disposal and at our fingertips, and there's so many supports that can be built into these, like reminders, video modeling, all sorts of things that more and more research is being done on, and it's all free. Simple things like wait time. Many people with autism have auditory processing delay, and not just people with autism, by the way. There are people at your workplace that have this too, who if you just wait an extra 2 seconds after asking a question, they will process and give you the right answer. But for so many of us in the business world, I know, and where I live here in New York or Long Island, it just feels awkward to do that wait. But this is super effective. It's on this list for a reason, because it actually works for businesses if they take a little bit extra time. Visual supports and written instructions. If you're going to ask someone to do something, follow up with an email. What we're seeing from a lot of these businesses, including Microsoft and Hewlett-Packard and SAP and others, is they've found that starting their autism hiring programs led to them becoming better managers in general, because they are very specific and concrete in their language. They're much more clear in how they're communicating with one another. They follow up all verbal requests and meetings with a summary email, and they're showing that these kinds of accommodations, if you want to call them that, are supporting everyone they work with. And then there are accommodations that may cost, but what we see for the most part for people with autism are accommodations like perhaps changing the type of lighting you use above his or her desk, because some people have these sensory sensitivities to certain types of lamps or lights. an accommodation may also be allowing them to wear a baseball cap or sunglasses in the office when there may be some rule in your HR rule book that doesn't allow that as part of the dress code. That's a real easy one to make. And this is not a joke. Like one of our board members is a professor who is on the autism spectrum, and his college does have a rule that professors are supposed to appear in a certain way. It does not work for him because of the lights in the different buildings. It's a very old college. They can't exactly change it so easily. So he wears a baseball cap everywhere he goes, and that is completely fine and was a great, easy accommodation to make. And there are people with more challenges who do need extra help, so we have job coaching and other kinds of supports. The good news is that in many cases, this is something that can be funded by your state, and AutismSpeaks would be happy to help you connect with the right agency to make sure that that's done. So there's lots of success stories out there. One thing that Leslie and I get concerned about sometimes is, I mentioned some of those companies earlier, they're getting a lot of press lately. Microsoft, SAP, Ernst & Young, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, and Google have all developed autism-specific hiring initiatives. So that should tell you something, that these leading-edge companies are recognizing the strengths here and taking advantage of the strengths people with autism tend to bring. They may also be kind of uniquely positioned to be, accommodating of different types of people. I mean, they've recognized they've always had people probably on the autism spectrum who are those quirky, brilliant types. Well, they can be a little bit more accommodating and hire people who have more challenges but have extraordinary skills as well. The problem, it's not a huge problem, but we are seeing people start to pigeonhole people with autism as, oh, you have autism, you're going to be a software tester, right? Or you want to work in tech. And it's just not true. So here's some examples. The man on the left, I know he's using a computer, but he's working in a hospital. What we're seeing is a really successful program called Project Search, working not just with hospitals anymore, but it began with Cincinnati Children's Hospital. It was giving people with autism positions as interns. And one of the positions that they kept hiring at the end of the internship was the position that preps your surgical equipment before your surgery. And, people with autism had this incredible attention to detail. They never made mistakes. And that can lead to catastrophe, right? A mistake putting the wrong instrument in a surgical prep kit. As you see on the right, the man is filing for a law firm. He happens to need to wear headphones during the day to drown out some of the outside ambient noise. Real easy accommodation, and he's an excellent filer or clerk for them. And then people doing, customer-facing positions, which you wouldn't think would be a great fit because we talked about the challenges that they have in many cases with communication and social interactions. But people with autism are capable of so many things, especially if it aligns with their interests. So people working at Home Depot, for instance, maybe don't have the best social skills, in a dating situation, but if you ask him to help you find a certain item, he knows the store better than anyone, right? So we can tap into the strengths and work with some of those weaknesses. So we do know some of the best practices that are out there in autism employment. One of the biggest challenges, believe it or not, is this recruitment piece. So those companies that have had success are kind of struggling. How do they build and expand? We talked about kind of the autism cliff, and what happens is in young adulthood, people with autism are very much disconnected. They're not connected in many cases to a service provider like a job coaching organization. They're not necessarily in a college, and they're not necessarily a part of many kind of social networks like LinkedIn. So, how can you connect? So we do have some pipelines being developed. There are more and more autism-specific college programs, support programs. Every year there are new programs being developed. You can tap into your local employment service provider organizations, most of whom don't serve people with autism exclusively, but they'll be serving people with all sorts of different disabilities. There are more and more online job search tools, and we've developed one that we're going to tell you quickly about in just a moment. But also tap into organizations like us. Ask AutismSpeaks for help. Tell us where you are, and we can help connect you with the local community, with service providers and everything else. The last one is really important. It's press. What you may have seen out there is, if you Google Microsoft and autism, you're going to get millions and millions of results. Most of that started with an announcement they made that they were going to hire 10 people with autism. They had press around the world, digital, traditional print media, television network spots, because this is such a need. You know, our community is so hungry. One company, I won't mention which one, announced that they were going to hire 4 people, and then they measured how much free press they got out of it, and it was nearly $2 million. So there's a real value to this, and our community is looking for that. Leslie mentioned one of the biggest hurdles is that traditional interview. It's just not set up for people whose disability is defined by challenges with communication and with social interaction. They're just not going to do well for the most part. So what we're seeing is companies that are successful in this are finding ways to be creative with their assessments. You know, in the best case scenario, it might be to completely take away the job interview, the traditional job interview, and do a job preview or design actual assessments that actually measure how good they are at the job you're hiring them to do. So for instance, those software tester positions, they don't really need to be great at sitting across the table from someone and making appropriate eye contact and witty banter and reciprocity. They don't need it. What they need to be able to do are certain tasks. So if you assess them on those tasks and hire them for that kind of skill level, those companies are seeing success. You know, trial work days to see if it works for you and that person. You know, getting a little bit creative, thinking a little bit out of the box instead of sticking with the tried and true ways we've always done hiring and interviewing. You know, also being super clear about the expectations and what the job interview entails. If you can't get rid of the job interview, you know, a really great strategy is sharing, if you can't share the exact questions, sharing, you know, some sort of preview, how many people will be there, what type of environment will be in. It really goes a long way in helping people with autism prepare and lowers some of the anxiety. Onboarding and training is really important, and it's not maybe what you think. Not so much of this work needs to be done for people with autism, but it's really important that the company takes some time and potentially some money to, you know, invest in better preparing their existing workforce, right? So training managers, hiring managers, HR, coworkers of a new person with autism coming on, basic stuff. It's not rocket science. You know, some of these companies that we mentioned, SAP and Microsoft, HPE and EY, have all been really great and open, and they want others to learn from them. So they have kind of this open invitation, and AutismSpeaks can help you connect to the right person at these companies. You know, what have they done, and what are some of their practices? HPE, for instance, is publishing all of their materials, including their risk assessments that they ran before they started the program. You know, they're willing to share this stuff so companies can learn from what they've done and what training they put in place to make sure this is successful. And, you know, the last point here is, you know, probably pretty obvious, but it ends up helping your entire company culture. It ends up impacting your customer as well when people are trained on what is sometimes called stigma training or disability training, kind of getting the hard-to-ask questions out of the way, things that people may be afraid of bringing up. You can do this in a safe way, and with professionals, it goes a long way, not just for those employees, but also for your customers and your culture at large. That's what these companies are seeing. So here's just really quickly, I mentioned that there are some job boards being developed. What we saw was something like 91% of people with disabilities would prefer to use an online job portal or jobs board that was designed for people like them. So that's what we did. This is a picture of a man with autism who works with us. He's created this website called thespectrumcareers.com, and he included kind of special tools that he wished he had had in his job search. So we mentioned how people with autism are visual learners. This includes, you know, you can upload a traditional job posting as a business or a traditional resume as a job seeker, or you can upload videos and photos that introduce your business, the environment, shows what the job actually entails. And likewise, you know, a person with autism can upload a video if they're not the most kind of, you know, verbal person or comfortable kind of speaking about themselves. They can just show you what they're capable of and some of the work they've done in the past. And this is a website that's free for everybody. You know, we're obviously excited to be working with Getting Hired because they've been doing this for a lot longer and have a lot of skill and experience with this. So we're really happy to be kind of working with them and trying to learn from them. So some of the things that the other things that AutismSpeaks is doing or that you can find on our website, autismspeaks.org, everything is always free. We have employment toolkits that we've written for people with autism, but also for employers and for parents. A new one that came out this year, it's not on our site because it was actually produced, I was able to be a part of it, but it was produced by Microsoft and a team that they're part of called the Global Impact Sourcing Coalition. And it's another free guide, and it tells some success stories. It's kind of an updated version of our own guide, but I'd be happy to share with you the link to that as well. But if you go to the Global Impact Sourcing Coalition, you can find it there for free download. And then we have an executive report. Part of this effort was to kind of highlight companies that are including people with disabilities as part of their diversity and inclusion policies. We think that's really important for our community, that this is the next frontier of true diversity and inclusion, that people with disabilities must be included, and it should start with the official policy of the company. We have had a small business accelerator program because we've seen lots of very small businesses, sometimes micro enterprises, being started around one person or a handful of people with autism and around their strengths and their interests. And then we have a Shop a Little, Help a Lot page that helps promote those businesses. So, next time you're going to buy like small kind of cheap trinkets for your coworkers for the holidays, instead of buying it from, Target, maybe you want to consider buying it from one of these small businesses that are run by people with autism. And, I think we're near the end here, but to kind of top line stuff that, how AutismSpeaks can help, we're always interested in having conversations about what your level of interest is. We are happy to provide kind of top level education. We do a lot of lunch and learns, webinars, in-person or webinars, kind of the basics of autism employment and introduction. We have quite a big network. So we are, maybe I should have started with this, but we are not a direct service provider, right? So AutismSpeaks is not the organization that would go in and provide job coaches on a daily basis or ongoing support. But what we can do is refer you to trusted members of our network. And we're across the country, and in some places we are international as well. We can help with that outreach to the local community. In each community, we have kind of an AutismSpeaks, virtual network. We have walks throughout the country every year. So we have, a couple million strong autism family that we can help connect you to as well. And then, obviously via the Spectrum Careers website, we can help connect you directly to job seekers. And then lastly, we do have a consultancy service that's called Advice. If you're interested in learning more about this, please let us know. This is a little bit different. This does have a cost, but AutismSpeaks and our funding partners fund half of the cost. And this is a much more kind of full-scale autism hiring initiative for like a regional or national project. But that is another option that you can explore with us if you're interested. And that's it. So we have about a little less than 20 minutes, and we'd love to answer any questions you may have or just entertain you with more success stories or some interesting things that Leslie and I have seen kind of on the horizon that we could talk about too. But Sarah, anything that you want to ask?
Yeah, no, thank you guys both so much for all of that great content. Again, just to reiterate to everybody, your line is on mute automatically. I'm not sure if this will open the floodgates, but if you press *6, that will unmute yourself if you have a question. Please also feel free to enter something into the chat box if you want me to read or call that out. Dave and Leslie, I know we spoke about this example before, but just because of the audience that we have, I know we have a mix of talent acquisition, recruiters, HR, even some job seekers on the line as well, and colleges and universities. We had spoken previously about how to read a resume, and I know you kind of touched on that a little bit, having a little bit more of a lens for if you're interviewing or hiring a person with autism. But when you're looking at a resume, one thing that I thought was really interesting that had been called out before is, really just understanding, again, that the professional experience that shows may not match the education. Someone might have 2 degrees in IT, for example, but their professional experience does not match that. So while someone may typically, as a recruiter, and I know I might even do this myself, read right over that resume, just having a little bit more of that trained eye for what to look at or any clues or indicators when you are reading through some of these candidates. Do you have any other tips there or anything else to add on that?
I think you brought up a great point. Go ahead, Dave.
Oh, sorry, Leslie. I was going to say it's absolutely a great point. It is what we see a whole lot of. And just as another kind of confounding variable here is, you know, for many of these folks, they're not going to disclose to you necessarily that there's someone with autism. There's a lot of fear still about the stigma of, you know, disclosing that you're on the autism spectrum. But I completely agree that, you know, you want to look beyond just a work experience, because what we do know is the vast majority of these folks will come to you with very little experience. And I want to add, though, that that has not stopped Google and Hewlett-Packard and the others from giving them an opportunity. Leslie?
And so the other, and I think it's important to note, we talked about it, maybe not on this particular call, but we've talked about it a lot, where there is really looking at the resume as somebody to train. Do they have the skills required to train, not necessarily have they worked in that particular industry? And sometimes it's hard to see from the resume, so you tend to have to either do a trial work period or have a walking interview and showing the job, or have somebody send a video resume of them actually doing the skill. And the jobs portal allows for that, but, you know, any company can request or recommend, you know, a video resume as an interview process.
No, that's really great. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
For a second. No. I just want to make sure you guys can hear me.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you for expanding on that. Kind of going along with it, just thinking about the interview process, again, I know you touched on this a little bit, but just wanted to call out, because this is something that really resonated with me just in previous conversations that we've had, some tips for the types of questions to ask, and I didn't know if you guys would be able to expand on that a little bit and just provide some additional detail and clarity. For example, asking more yes-no questions rather than questions that might involve future state, like asking, you know, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Or, you know, I know those types of questions can be difficult for anybody, but especially if you have a certain personality or a certain way of thinking where maybe you're not able to think about an answer in the same way that someone may understand.
Yeah, that's an excellent point too. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Leslie, I keep doing that.
That's okay.
I just, you know, one instance or one example is actually the perfect one you just gave, is something that is abstract. So, you know, the question like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Most of us know what that question is trying to get at, but someone who takes language very, very literally, you know, may give you a pretty strange answer about where they see themselves. Like in the mirror, you know, it can be a real challenge. So really checking your language to try and make sure it's as concrete, straightforward as you can. I know yes or no questions aren't going to get you the information you probably need in a job interview. So I'm not saying you have to stick to those, but really checking your language, and we try and do this ourselves here at AutismSpeaks. We have lots of, you know, several coworkers who are on the autism spectrum, and, you know, just kind of checking how we're using language and making sure that it's as concrete and as straightforward as we possibly can. And again, that tip, if you have to stick with a traditional interview, if you're able to give the questions ahead of time, even just 24 hours, or to give kind of categories to let them know where you're going to be asking questions about, it goes a long way. I mean, there's a lot of anxiety amongst people, anyone in a job interview, but I think particularly so for people with autism and with these kinds of social and communication challenges. Leslie, do you have any other kind of tips on that?
You know, when I talk to colleagues on the spectrum or I need information, I double-check that they've understood the question I've asked, and it has nothing to do with intellect. It has to do with processing. And I tend to talk fast, and I give directions very quickly. So I usually take a step back and say, let me see if I can explain this, or I give an example. and I ask the person to give me an example of how this problem was solved before. So it's just a matter of taking a little bit more time and care, and you usually get a much more thoughtful answer than just a back and forth where you know the person has practiced how to interview and you know they're giving you just the patent answers. Somebody on the spectrum is really going to think about the question you've asked. So asking it in the most thoughtful and comprehensive way is really a great tool to use.
That's great, and I actually just had a number of questions come through the chat box. So for everybody who did ask something, please, if we don't get to your question in the next 10 minutes, I do have all these written down, and I can follow up with you via email and with Dave and Leslie as well. One question was, how should coworkers be trained to prepare themselves for working with a person with autism, which to me sounds like, is there any additional training that should be provided to the organization and the workplace? Any other thoughts that you have on that, Dave and Leslie?
Yeah, well, Dave talked about some of the things that we've done with companies. So, for example, we've done lunch and learns where everybody's invited, so you're not sort of pointing out that you're doing it for a person or you're doing it for a particular colleague. It's just an awareness of people on the spectrum that are adults because, again, in a work environment, you're working with adults. And so it's not just an autism awareness, it's more success stories. We also have recommendations that we could give on video training that's beginning to happen with companies where a manager can watch a video or their colleagues can watch a video on how to work with somebody with autism. And the full comprehensive training, as Dave mentioned, is through advice, which is a consultative program. But I do want to add that throughout the country, each state has a vocational rehabilitation agency that is federal and state funded. They should have, and I say should, have somebody that is an autism expert or an autism liaison that they either have employed there or in a community provider agency. Most people are happy to come into a company and explain the benefits of hiring people on the spectrum or how to work with a coworker, and that should be for free because, again, you're going through the local rehabilitation agency or the local service provider. They want a job developed. They want companies to hire. So they're going to come in because it's really like somebody selling their product, so they're selling their services. So that would be another way that could be, and you usually find as you do, whether it's the webinar or other things like that, you find coworkers that are either parents or siblings. You do find people that are connected to the spectrum and then help to take on answering sometimes questions that may be helpful.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think Leslie really nailed it with all that stuff. We do have kind of tips that we include with our kind of lunch and learn, and a lot of it is around the language we use. So simplifying or making it much more direct and concrete, avoiding slang and things like that. The overall message is like you want to act and treat them just like you would anyone else, but there are some special considerations to keep in mind. Maybe providing extra cues with verbal instructions. Yeah.
I was just going to say, too, that, things like the fire alarm is going to go off as a test. That person may need to be notified a little bit ahead of time than others, or that the lights are going to be flashing. So just as you would maybe accommodate somebody with a visual impairment, which, I think we've gotten used to for years, or somebody with a hearing impairment, those are kind of the sensory issues you may need to prepare the person and their manager for.
Yeah, and just the last kind of message, Sarah, I think for this is that you want colleagues to, and we talk about this in schools too, but you want them to presume competence. Don't, to watch your biases. Don't assume that because this new colleague is someone with autism that they're not capable. that's certainly not the case. If they've been hired, it's because they're capable of the job. And I think people are really pleasantly surprised, and their anxiety is quickly relieved, once they start these kinds of programs. So it's a lot more about, actually the bias training, I think they officially call it fear and stigma training, because there is fear of the unknown and something new. And basic training, just some real simple tips really, really go a long way, and it's often surprising to the companies.
Thank you for that summary. I think that's a great reiteration and expansion on some of the things that you guys spoke about in today's webinar, and really something actionable to take back for any organization or anyone probably on today's call. One last question that I think we'll just have time for. Somebody had asked, is there a list of specific colleges that either of you know of that have autism-specific career services programs that can be shared and they can reach out to?
Yeah.
I'm actually, so we were talking about this recently. So we have a list. I don't think it's actually publicly, well, no, so let me start back. We have a toolkit called the Post-Secondary Educational Opportunities Toolkit. So it's part of our toolkits collection. If you go to the back of that toolkit, which is free for download, there is a resource section that lists a lot of different schools. But it's a couple years old now, so we're going to be doing some updating. So, if you take a look at that, but also reach out to us, because we can help kind of update the list and send to you, because really it's happening all the time, new ones. Now, the one challenge, though, Sarah, is that you mentioned kind of career offices and disability offices, and what we're still seeing is a major disconnect, and this is not just affecting students with autism, but students with all sorts of disabilities, that career services is not integrated with disability services on campus. So part of this larger kind of effort needs to be helping them to better connect. So, your businesses are probably in touch with the Career Services Office, but they're not getting access to the students who have self-disclosed as being on the spectrum or any other disability. Just something to think about.
And I wanted to ask, and if we're also talking about, are there professionals being trained to work with the autism community? That's also a question that we see asked, because companies may want to reach out to those colleges. There are colleges that train staff to work with people with autism, with whether it's a BCBA or other behavior analysis training or other mechanisms. There also are colleges for that.
Yeah, and Dave, to exactly what you said, I know that's something that Getting Hired and AutismSpeaks have spoken about before, and something that I think we are definitely, both of our organizations are working on to try and help bridge that gap just between disability centers and career centers, if there is a gap. Not all colleges and universities have that. Some have really strong partnerships, but just for all students with disabilities and non-apparent disabilities, and having them understand that really all the same accessible resources need to be in all career centers. So I think that's a great resource that AutismSpeaks has. For anyone on the line who's a current partner with Getting Hired, you can reach out to me or your designated account manager as well for more information on our community partnerships and colleges and universities that we work with. We'd be more than happy to talk with you about that. But we are pretty much at time. Again, just to reiterate, for everybody on the line, we are not sending out the slides, but we did record today's training, and we will send a link to the recorded version afterwards. It might just take a couple of days, so don't worry if you don't see it by the end of the day today or tomorrow afternoon. And if we did not get to your question, I did copy all of your questions down, and I believe I have everybody's email address that you used with your registration, so we will reach out to you directly, and I'll connect with Dave and Leslie after today's training for their responses and insight. So thank you again for everybody who attended today. Dave and Leslie, is there anything else that you wanted to add?
Well, I'm just thankful for the partnership and all the people that attended. It was great numbers, and we can't tell you how much we're appreciative of that.
Yeah, well said.
All right, great. Well, we will give everybody just a minute back to their day, and thank you again for attending. Dave and Leslie, I will follow up with you, but everyone have a great rest of your week. Thank you so much.